is now on her feet, giving her prepared statement.
The inquiry lasted 7 years and its findings are harrowing. Widespread child sexual abuse going back decades and shameful institutional failures in child protection. Each case represents an intensely personal story of pain and suffering of a child enduring something that nobody should. I'm so sorry that anyone has. The interests of victims and survivors are at the heart of the inquiry's report and of the government's response. I want to thank the more than 6,000 victims and survivors who bravely came forward to share their testimonies. I was humbled and moved when meeting with several of them recently. Today is about ensuring that their voices are heard and reflected in our work, so that future generations do not suffer as they did. I promise that their courage will count. I also pay tribute to the chair of the inquiry, Professor Alexis Jay, and her team for their fearless commitment in uncovering horrendous societal, professional, and institutional failures, and for years of meticulous and diligent work. We must use this moment to bring this crime further out of the shadows, provide proper support to all victims and survivors, and deliver real and enduring change. This government has repeatedly shown its determination to stop the scourge of child sexual abuse. Just last month, the Prime Minister and I announced new measures to tackle the evil of grooming gangs. But there is zero room for complacency, and the inquiry's final report confronts us with a necessary moment for further reflection. It is more than a collection of recommendations. It is a call for fundamental change, cultural change, societal change, professional and institutional change. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am pleased to say that this government has risen to the inquiry's challenge. We are accepting the need to act on 19 out of the inquiry's 20 final recommendations. This includes driving work across government to improve the victim's experience of the criminal justice system, the Criminal Injuries Compensation Scheme, workforce regulation, access to records, consistent and compatible data, and communications on the scale and nature of child sexual abuse. The government response does not represent our final word on the inquiry's findings, but rather the start of a new chapter. We will continue to engage with victims and survivors, with child protection organisations and with Professor Jay to ensure they retain visibility into our work and confidence in our delivery. The full government response will be published online at gov.uk. The Welsh Government has also responded separately on these matters relating to Wales alone. I want to now highlight our response to some of the most consequential recommendations, Madam Deputy Speaker. We need to stop perpetrators in their tracks and better protect and support the children they seek to prey upon. To do this, we must address the systemic underreporting of child sexual abuse. As I announced in April, the government accepts the inquiry's recommendation to introduce a new mandatory reporting duty across England. And today, I'm launching the call for evidence, which will inform how this new duty can be best designed to prevent the continued abuse of children and ensure they get help as soon as possible. The inquiry recommended a redress scheme for victims and survivors of historic child sexual abuse, which the government also accepts. Of course, nobody can ever fully compensate victims and survivors for the abuse they suffered. But what we can do is properly acknowledge their suffering, deliver justice, and an appropriate form of redress. This is a landmark commitment. It will be complex and it will be challenging, but it really matters. As the inquiry recommends, we will carefully consult victims and survivors. We will draw on lessons from other jurisdictions, and we will make sure that we honour the inquiry's legacy as we design this scheme. Now, we accept there is more we can do to ensure those who have suffered get access to the provision they need to help them recover and rebuild their lives. We have already introduced the Victims and Prisoners Bill, which will ensure the criminal justice system delivers on victims' entitlements. It will also introduce a new statutory duty on local partners to work together when commissioning support services for victims of sexual violence. But where we need to go further, we will. We will elicit views on the future of therapeutic support, including systemic changes to provision through the extensive consultation we are undertaking on redress. It is right that we consider these things together so that we can better deliver the support needed by child and adult victims and survivors of abuse. The inquiry rightly demands proper leadership and governance of child protection. Since the inquiry's recommendation for a new child protection authority, the Department for Education's implementation strategy, Stable Home Built on Love, has set out major reform to children's social care. Although taking a different form, we are confident that these reforms will fulfil the proposed functions of such a child protection agency and ensure a coherent response across all parts of the system to child sexual abuse. The government will, however, closely monitor the delivery of our commitments through our newly established Child Protection Ministerial Group, inviting scrutiny from victims, survivors, and other partners. We will keep this House and the other place regularly updated on our progress. The inquiry makes two recommendations relating to the horrifying and growing threat of online child sexual abuse. The government's online safety bill will be a truly world-leading law that will make the UK the safest place to be online. The strongest measures in the bill are reserved for child sexual abuse, leaving companies in no doubt about their duties to remove and report child sexual abuse material found on their platforms and use technologies like age verification. Child sexual abuse is a global crime, which is why we continue to lead work with international partners to bring pressure to bear on the big tech companies who must face up to their moral duty to protect children. Madam Deputy Speaker, there is no greater evil than hurting a child. This landmark inquiry found that for far too long, stopping child sexual abuse was seen as no one's responsibility. We must ensure that child abuse is brought out of the shadows. We must make it everyone's responsibility. And we must give those who have suffered the confidence that their voices will be heard, their needs will be met, and that they will be protected. We owe a great debt of gratitude to the victims and survivors who came forward, to their families and to their campaigners. Today is their moment, and it must be a watershed moment. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement and join her in paying tribute to the victims and survivors of this hideous crime. Many of those victims and survivors have been crucial to establishing the inquiry in the first place and also have been involved working hard to make sure that voices are heard and their strength should be recognised, their calls to action must be heeded. There is no more hideous crime than child sexual exploitation and abuse, a crime that preys on vulnerability and leaves scars that are felt for the rest of a young person's life. And the independent inquiry set up by the Home Secretary's predecessor, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, identified failings across a wide range of institutional settings and including local councils, the Anglican and Catholic churches, organised groups and networks, and in each area, action is needed to make sure that that abuse is tackled wherever it is found. Can I welcome the government's acceptance that there needs to be a redress scheme for victims and survivors of historic abuse? And can I ask her the timetable and what the next steps will be on this, as that trauma can last a lifetime and is truly devastating for those who experience it? But can I also say to the Home Secretary, the rest of the statement is inadequate as a government response to such a serious and weighty report. I'm glad she's accepted the need to act on 19 out of 20 recommendations. That is not the same as accepting the recommendations, nor is it the same as setting out what action she's actually going to take. For example, the inquiry said that victims and survivors should receive a guarantee of specialist therapeutic support. All her statement says is we will elicit views on the future of therapeutic support. Well, we know that therapeutic support is inadequate, and we know that there are lots of views already. That was the whole point of the inquiry, to gather those views and that evidence. And on many of the recommendations, there is little detail, and all she has done is simply point to what the government is doing already. I really hope that there is more in the full report that she refers to, but there is far too little to give any confidence in the statement that she has set out today. On mandatory reporting for child sexual abuse, Labour called for this near a decade ago. The government finally agreed to do it in April, but all she's done today is open a call for evidence. Well, there have already been lots of calls for evidence. In fact, the inquiry gathered lots of evidence, and at best she could have launched her own call for evidence some time ago. Why isn't the mandatory reporting in the Victims' Bill? That is our opportunity to make progress rapidly. And it is far too weak in her response on online child sexual abuse. She's referred to the bill. We know that is long delayed and watered down, but this is not just about the legislation, it's also about the action that is taken. Since then, we've had an inspectorate report on online abuse that described the police response to online child sexual abuse and exploitation as too often leaving vulnerable children at risk, with examples of police taking up to 18 months to make an arrest after becoming aware children were at risk of abuse. There was nothing on that in her statement. What action is she going to take on policing? New evidence too from the Internet Watch Foundation finding that the number of web pages containing Category A material has more than doubled since 2020, just in the last few years alone. And again, the response is wholly inadequate. On charging, we know that the charge rates have got worse and worse. Every year, approximately 500,000 children will be sexually abused. Only 1 in 5 of those are likely to report their abuse. But only 11% of the cases that are reported result in a charge, down from over 30% in 2015. It has got so much worse over the last few years. That means the overwhelming majority of child sexual abusers are facing no consequences. Criminals are getting away with these terrible, terrible crimes. It's even got worse than the last time we discussed this topic in the House in October as well. And on child protection and the barring service, again, we have warned about gaps in the disclosure and barring system. Again, there are still problems there. And only last year, we had unaccompanied asylum-seeking children being placed in hotels without properly trained DBS staff. What has she done since then, even to reform child protection in her own department? Children and teenagers have paid the price of the country's failure to tackle child sexual abuse and exploitation. The Home Secretary's predecessor did rightly set up this inquiry, but there is a responsibility on every single one of us, and in particular on the Home Secretary and on the government, to make sure that there is actually action that takes place. This is about the victims and survivors, but it is also about future generations of children whose safety and lives will be at risk if we do not see action.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her questions and her response, and the manner in which she's approached this topic of the utmost seriousness. As I said in my statement, the report represents fundamental change to the way in which we deal with child abuse, and I hope that the recommendations that we are taking forward today demonstrate the government's commitment to tackling this evil. She asks about timetable and pace. On the speed of the report and our response, I hope the Right Honourable Lady will appreciate that it is important that we not only took the time to get the report right, or the independent assessor, Professor Jay, but she will also understand that it is vital that we consider things thoroughly now so that we make the most out of the recommendations and we ensure that we actually deliver the level of reform that will make a meaningful difference on the ground to victims and survivors and will make a difference in culture and prevent this from happening again. This is reform on a level not seen before. It will mark a step change in our approach to child sexual abuse. We need to and we will get it right. And if that takes time, that is time well spent. I do not want to give victims and survivors the false impression that implementing these big commitments will just happen overnight. But what I can promise them is that we are today heralds a new start. It signifies a change in direction and it represents an acknowledgement of what they've been through, what they've testified and the work of this inquiry. The government has accepted the need to act on 19 out of the 20 recommendations. We are accepting the vast majority of these recommendations. I hope that reflects our genuine and real commitment to get this right. I've also committed today to closely monitoring police force data on child sexual abuse, both to ensure that the police are appropriately prioritising this terrible crime, but also to identify where they need other partners like tech companies to improve their own response. Let me be clear. We will do whatever it takes, whatever is necessary to protect children from abuse. No ifs and no buts. Let me issue a few thanks. I want to put on record my thanks to my honourable friend, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, my predecessor, for launching this inquiry, recognising the problem and starting this important work. I want to put on record my thanks to my Right Honourable friend, the Member, the Secretary of State for Education, the Lord Chancellor, and other Cabinet Secretaries who've come together to support this government response. This will require a whole of government response. It will require a multi-agency response if we are to genuinely protect the interests of children. But above all, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to thank the victims and their families for sharing their stories, for helping us to make this big step forward. I have had the honour of meeting with members of the Victims and Survivors Consultative Panel. Today, I met with professionals who are working on the front line, members of the police force, members and employees at the Centre for Expertise for Child Sexual Abuse, hosted at Barnardo's and funded by the Home Office. I visited the Lighthouse Centre in Camden, which provides real therapeutic support to children who've encountered this kind of horrific abuse. And I've worked and met with the NPCC. At SPCC. I thank all of those professionals on the front line. This is a complex issue. Its enormity cannot be underestimated. I'm enormously grateful to the victims and survivors for their courage. This abuse should never have happened, but I hope that with these changes, we will make a difference and prevent future abuse from taking place. We owe that to past victims and to their families.
Ms. Theresa May.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to my Right Honourable friend for her statement today. When I launched set up the panel, independent inquiry, I said that people would be shocked at the level of abuse of children that had taken place in this country. And indeed, the final report showed an appalling and shocking level of abuse, not just historic, but abuse that carries on today. So the government's response is very important. Those who wish to abuse children will look for opportunities to work with children in order to undertake that abuse. Could my Right Honourable friend please say a little more detail about the government's response to the number of recommendations in the report on the disclosure and barring service, the use of barring of disclosure regime for those working with children overseas, and the extending barring of people from working with children who are unsuitable to do so?
Home Secretary.
My Right Honourable friend is absolutely right to point out that we need to enhance the rigour, scrutiny and standards within the workforce when it comes to professionals who have direct contact or responsibilities relating to children. And that's why the recommendations, several of the recommendations relate to registration of care staff in residential care. We accept that recommendation. The registration of staff in young offender institutions and secure training act centres, we accept that, and we are exploring the proposals on how to operate it. We're looking at the recommendations relating to the barred list of people who are unsuitable for work, and the recommendation relating to the duties to inform the disclosure and barring service about individuals who may pose a risk. We are accepting those recommendations as well, and we are exploring the ways and the form in which we can deliver those.
Sarah Champion.
The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, they're answering questions on the announcement that the government is committing to a redress scheme for victims and survivors of child sexual abuse. It's going to be set up on the back of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. The main